Welcome to The Green Rush, a podcast about the intersection of cannabis, the capital markets, and culture. On a weekly basis, hosts Ann Donahoe and Louis Goldberg of KCSA Strategic Communications speak with the business leaders, financial experts, cultural icons, legislators, and generally interesting people moving the cannabis industry forward. This week, Louis and Ann are speaking with Louis Koski, Chief Operating Officer of Metrc, one of the nation's leading seed-to-sale software companies. Metrc is America's leading solution for cannabis and hemp governance. Its software, technology, and support teams track cannabis products from seed to sale, ensuring a closed legal business ecosystem. Metrc's solutions ensure a secure supply chain, transparency, and public health, providing a safe marketplace for everyone. Louis has a super interesting background coming from Colorado, where he was that state's director of marijuana enforcement. It'd be fair to say that he knows where the industry's skeletons are. So don't sit back, lean forward. Now into our conversation with Louis Koski from Metrc.
Louis, welcome to the Green Rush, and great spelling. You're the first person I know in this industry who spells Louis the right way, which is Lewis.
I was going to say the same thing to you, Louis.
It's nice to run into a brethren namesake. You're the chief operating officer of a pretty amazing company called Metrc. Can you take a moment, explain what Metrc is, what the problems are that you guys solve, and ultimately, as the chief operating officer, what do you do all day?
Okay. Well, so Metrc is the leading solution for cannabis and hemp governance. Our software is based, our software, our RFID technology, and all of the support teams that live around the software and the technology. We track cannabis products from seed to sale, ensuring that every regulated industry that we're in has a closed legal ecosystem. So Metrc Solutions ensures the authenticity of the product through the RFID technology, creates a secure supply chain, and we think that it adds to a credible and safe regulated marketplace. And we're proudly serving 13 states right now, along with the District of Columbia, and there's well over 15,000 businesses that utilize Metrc on a daily basis, and that number is continuing to surge every day.
Can we talk a little bit about your background in the cannabis space, pre-Metrc? You were the former director of enforcement in Colorado, where you oversaw the transition from medical to adult use. I have to imagine you have, a lot of really amazing stories. But what are some of the lessons you learned in managing that transition?
Well, I'll answer the first part of the question first, and then just give you a little bit more of my background. In 2010, I was working for Colorado's Gaming Control Commission as a senior investigator and supervisory investigator with that agency. And at that time, early in 2010, Colorado's legislature decided that it was going to have our department, the Department of Revenue, which had the gaming division in it, they're going to have us start regulating the businesses that had been popping up in Denver and some of the other metropolitan areas. In fact, they estimated about 1,100 companies were operating in an unregulated fashion around Colorado. So they passed some regulations back in 2010. I'm not sure if it was a meeting that I missed or if I volunteered. It's been so long ago, but I ended up transitioning to the new division there within the Department of Revenue to help set up their licensing investigation section to get new applications in, and then also to help set up their field enforcement unit. And I ended up being part of that division through the beginning days of licensing medical businesses all the way through 2.5 years or more of implementation of the adult use market. At the time the adult use sales began in January of 2014, I was the director of the division by that time, and largely responsible for helping to design the regulations that would be promulgated that covered everything from licensing and labeling to testing of the product to production controls, implementing systems that would monitor for compliance and enforcement. Those were all things that we did during that transitional period.
Louis, you must have looked at a bunch of other industries for your inspiration to pull this amalgam of different rules and regulations. What were those industries? I mean, you mentioned gaming, so pun intended. I bet you took a bunch from that. But was it alcohol? Was it pharma? I mean, where did you pull these rules from?
Well, if you recall Amendment 64, which was the constitutional amendment in Colorado, they said regulate it like alcohol. Within weeks of that amendment passing and getting together robust stakeholder groups in the state of Colorado, we realized pretty quickly that it wasn't a lot like regulating alcohol. That's not to say we didn't use regulations from alcohol, but there was a lot of things that just didn't transfer across as cleanly as I think everybody thought it would. I distinctly remember back at about the same period, I was having a conversation with my boss, and we were talking about all of the rules and regulations and how daunting this was going to be, especially with our names in the front of the book in the state of Colorado with all the regulations. And at the time, I didn't realize it until he had mentioned it to me. And for all of my professional life, anytime my name was going to be put on something, it was important for me for it to be something that was of high caliber, very professional, and very well thought out. And I will tell you that was probably the night before that was the last good night of sleep I had for about 5 years. But one of the ways we started.
It's your fault. It's all your fault.
I would suggest that there's some responsibility borne by me and some of the decisions that we made back in those days, for sure. So I will take some of the blame, but I'm also happy to take some of the credit, because when you're filling in all the blank pages that were legalization, we did have to borrow, just like you suggested. We borrowed a lot from the gaming industry when it came to approving licensees and vetting applicants for suitability. We also used a lot of the surveillance regulations and standards that came out of gaming to help establish some of those regulations in legalization. We did use some from alcohol, but what we found is the best way to really find best practices in this was to pull together a real diverse group of stakeholders to the table, to have them lend their expertise, not just from other regulated industry, but what are some really good business practices that we might want to incorporate, and how can we borrow from those, along with some bits and pieces from other regulatory frameworks to start piecing this all together.
Louis, now that Colorado is firmly underway, they've got a pretty thriving market. There's definitely hiccups, obviously, but if you look at states like Massachusetts and Maine, why do you think they have struggled so mightily when it feels like Colorado really did a lot of the heavy lifting for them?
Well, first of all, I would say that Maine and Massachusetts are probably not struggling nearly as much as everyone thinks. And I also think that people tend to forget that the first 18 months of licensing medical businesses in Colorado was very, very challenging. In fact, we had budget shortfalls. We had literally hundreds of businesses operating for a year. without the first set of regulations. And so even though I would say that the transition from medical to adult use in Colorado went very smoothly, it also happened after there were a number of really big challenges, outright failures, of which I would take responsibility for some of the decisions that I made in terms of licensing and things like that. I could have made some better decisions and had things move along a little.
Which way, in terms of licensing people who or rejecting people, and you're like, I'm thinking back, I should have given them a license, or I should never have given that guy a license?
No, I wouldn't say it fell into that category. It's more of the category of So we talked earlier about how we borrowed a lot of the regulations on background investigations and suitability requirements and due diligence from casino gambling. That works great in a jurisdiction that has less than 100 licensees. We started out with 1,000, so the scope of that investigation was just too big. And we ended up tailoring down the scope of that investigation to meet the size and the needs of that industry. And initially, I don't think we hit that mark as well as we could have.
I want to ask a question about the background checks, and we'll get to Metrc. I promise you we'll get to Metrc. But this is really fascinating because you are at the core of one of the first 2 adult use licensed regimes that have been looked at and picked apart by all of the other adult use states, and while I joked that it's your fault, fault's the wrong word. I think everybody owes you a debt of gratitude in this industry, because were it not for you and your department, there would not be a state by state licensed adult use market. So, we'll give you a chance to crow, and if you want to do any mea culpas, that too. But one of the questions I have is, you're describing this structure of background investigations into applicants. Is there more investigation done in terms of looking at a cannabis applicant than, say, somebody who wants to open up just a general pharmacy or even a liquor store? And if so, why?
Well, I would say now, though the liquor store and the marijuana licensees are probably similar in scope, and I would say that they're of moderate complexity. I think what tends to make the liquor comparison in cannabis less practical is there aren't too many publicly traded liquor stores, right? And I think what we're seeing
I've never thought of it like that before.
But there weren't. But when you guys opened up the in 2014, there weren't really publicly traded cannabis companies. There were a small handful. I mean, that really didn't start to accelerate until 16, 17, and 18. Were you anticipating this?
They needed money.
Well, they needed money, but Louis, when you were writing these regs, were you anticipating the public cannabis markets?
So yeah. I mean, we were absolutely anticipating that the market would ultimately consolidate, and that people who were participating in the cannabis marketplace that were not able to live up to a comprehensively regulated framework were going to likely get purchased by businesses that could. And so there were, I'll just put it this way. From my first week on the job in July of 2010, we had conversations about publicly traded companies. In fact, there were companies that whether they were traded on the pink sheets or came from a shell company, there was conversation about how people would try and get enough business going in Colorado that they might look at becoming a publicly traded company. And at the time, you're right, those types of business entities were prohibited because there's also a residency requirement. And what we've seen is that residency requirement has really kind of trailed off and is a lot less common than what it originally was back in those real early days. And so we see some of the bigger markets like California, now Colorado, and so on and so forth across the country. Publicly traded companies and various other structures allow for a number of investment vehicles that just weren't there in the early days.
Louis, you split your time really between the government and the industry side. And as I'm actually moving to the vaping crisis, if that's okay. It's not making the same headlines as it did today, as it did last fall. Do you think the industry handled it the right way, or are there things there that the industry in general could have done better?
Well, I think the real wake-up call for the industry with the vaping crisis is that the credibility of that regulated framework is always going to be a target for things like the vaping crisis that happened, and even moreover, you could essentially have a handful of really bad actors within the vaping industry altogether that aren't even participating like they should in the regulated marketplace, who are giving the regulated marketplace a really bad name. And if you did follow this story in the press, you know that there was a lot of confusion and a lot of ambiguity about where the problem really existed. And what we learned from that is something that we were already aware of, and we were reminded of how important it is in the cannabis regulated framework that the product is tracked so closely from the time it's a little baby plant all the way to the time it's harvested, to the time it's transported to manufacturers and ultimately gets to the stores. And since it's tracked so closely, and we've tracked well over 1 billion different data points since 2014 in our system. And we're able to actually track product that could be causing a public health problem with the push of a button. We're able to track it back to all of the hundreds and hundreds of plants that might have been used in the production of that particular product. So put that into perspective of the vaping crisis. The vaping crisis, the biggest challenge there is we knew that the vaping products were really causing some harm. It took a long time for health authorities to be able to determine what the problem was. So they were having to put these big, large, kind of broad brushstrokes bans on product, and they really didn't even have a way of being able to know whether those bans were actually going into effect by people that were selling the product. Well, in the regulated framework, you could. In fact,
but does a ban make sense? I mean, the entire cannabis market is a conversion play. We're taking the illicit, unregulated, untaxed market and converting it into a regulated, taxed market. But there's already illicit market vapes on the market. If you ban vaping, aren't we just pushing people back to the unregulated market, which doesn't have Metrc and the seed to sale tracking that you guys provide? It doesn't have regulatory oversight to ensure the ability to recall by lot number. I mean, what Massachusetts did, which was ban all vaping products, it didn't stop people from vaping. It just stopped them from vaping regulated, licensed, taxed product. I mean, who got it right? What state? I looked at Illinois and they said, I don't know what the fuck to do, so I'm not really going to do anything, which might have been the best response by any state. Who do you think got it right?
Well, so you make a lot of good points there. And I don't know that there's a real easy answer for whether a ban works or not, but let's unpackage it a little bit. And I'll start with Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, within 48 hours of Governor Baker's vaping ban declaration, you guys might not be aware of this, but Massachusetts licensees used our system to identify and quarantine and report all at the same time the vaping products that they had in their facilities. So once all that product was identified, the regulator also has visibility into those disclosures They're able to use that data to test the products and identify which products are causing harm and which ones aren't, and remove the dangerous products from the market. We think that that's the absolute ideal situation where the regulator can identify the universe of products, hold it in the stream of commerce, and identify which product is causing harm potentially and which ones are not. And so that's what I was kind of talking to you about earlier, where this was a bit of a wake-up call for the industry. On one hand, they're going, we're so well regulated, we can identify the product. The ones who are not are the ones that are causing the problem. The good news, so that's the best case scenario. The good news about a ban in a situation where you don't have Metrc tracking all the product is that it does serve the purpose of trying to stop product in the stream of commerce until you can identify the problem, but it doesn't support the regulator's need for data to be able to quickly identify the problem, quickly identify the bad product and take it out, while still allowing all the other product that's safe to move forward in stream of commerce. And so we're able to do that in Massachusetts. And so even though a ban in of itself might serve the purpose of starting to help, it really harms those good actors in the marketplace who have to put their product on hold while health authorities work with almost nothing to try and solve the issue.
I mean, is this ultimately a problem because there is no federal oversight? You know, if there was a federal infrastructure like there is for recalling Tylenol, if there's a bad lot,
or lettuce,
or lettuce, exactly. I mean, was this not the moment that the industry should have gone down to Washington and say, "Hey, schmucks, we need you," right? This isn't even about banking; it's about consumer protection. But they didn't do this. So, is this just a missed opportunity by the industry to turn shit into shinola?
Well, I don't know that it's as much of a missed opportunity as it's still an opportunity, right? I think as this is still continuing to unfold and as it still tends to be get some play in the media, it's certainly a topic that's on the front of mind for a lot of folks. We're talking about it today, right? So I think the opportunity is still there. The question might be, where do you want to start? And I would argue that the unregulated part of the vaping industry that probably bore the most responsibility in the public health issues that were created. And because of that, we might be able to glean from the details of the vaping crisis that more regulation might be helpful. But again, we tend to think of it as more regulation is only helpful if it's supported by a really strong set of data that allows the regulators to see what happens into the supply chain, so they're better able to control a problem like this when it happens. And so I think that could be addressed both at the state and the federal level to say, hey, at the federal level, we're importing vaping products from outside of the country. We have no idea what the source of the product was. There's no regulation on that. And there's no way to know what kind of health and safety standards were employed during the production of that product. We need to start making sure that we know those details before the product gets released to the wholesalers and ultimately to the customer.
I mean, it sounds like what you guys do is you give states you empower them with actionable data. So, so without this type of information, a state like Massachusetts could never know, what products are tainted and what things are out there. So I kind of want to stay on this topic a little bit, but I want to broaden it out a little bit too. So there's 34 states, 33 have a regulated cannabis program in place and, more coming. What states do you feel like have the best regulatory structure in place that meets the needs of the cannabis industry as well as its consumers?
Well, without naming states, I would say that.
Oh no, name names, man.
Or
Let's
your
Um,
come on.
we're asking you to name your favorites.
Yes, who's your favorite
let me
child?
start without. Let me at least start without naming names. I think there's some characteristics of a really strong regulated framework that we've seen, and these characteristics have been employed differently, but the results seem to be pretty consistent. So I think when you have number one, when you have really strong leadership coming from the executive branch of the state, that tends to trickle down to the executive branch agencies, and there tends to be a lot of cooperation and priority that's placed on trying to get legalization right. To name a couple of states that I think have done that really well, Colorado did that really well. Governor Hickenlooper put together a task force within weeks of Amendment 64 passing, and that kind of set the model that people have followed in terms of getting the right stakeholders to the table. I also think Massachusetts has done a really good job in putting together the commission. I really like the commission because it kind of incorporates some of the spirit of Governor Hickenlooper's task force, and that it has a number of different viewpoints that.
Yeah, but Massachusetts has moved unbelievably slowly, right? Like there's 100 stores maybe in Massachusetts open. They've had 4 years to get this going. So the regulatory structure may be nice, but if you live in Massachusetts, it's kind of sucked.
well, I will tell you that sometimes the number of licensees in the jurisdiction isn't necessarily the best indicator of how quickly they've moved. Right. I would say we had close to 1,500 licenses or so in the medical space in Colorado in 2014. Do you know how many licenses we had in the first 60 days of legalization? Probably about 20. And so, and you guys look at, and by the way, I appreciate it because we did do a pretty good job there in Colorado. We still see that as kind of like the model jurisdiction. And so I don't know that license numbers are always the best way to evaluate whether or not things are moving along well.
I don't know.
But I would say,
look, Louis,
I would say in terms of leadership, having the Cannabis Control Commission there and using a diverse group of stakeholders is really important.
I agree with you. And look, Shalene title is great, and what ultimately what they have done from a regulatory structure is fantastic. But 4 years, you just said you got 1,500 licenses done in the first year. It's 4 years. It's a long time. And that delay has been had a huge impact on the public companies, right? Because they all anticipated Massachusetts being materially impactful to their earnings, in 17 or in 18. And, we're in 20. And most probably these, the state isn't going to have nearly the same impact that Illinois is going to have. And that's, this year, it just converted this year. So it's kind of hard to say that the regulatory structure in Massachusetts has worked because it hasn't. And I don't mean to, I'm not picking on you, but.
No, I don't live in Massachusetts. I live in Florida. I just tend to think that, hey, look, I got experience, not just from Colorado, but during my consulting days, we worked for a number of jurisdictions. And one thing that I think is important to note is I don't know that there is one regulatory structure that is the best. In fact, I would argue that there's probably a number of regulatory structures that work. What really matters though is that you have really strong leadership at the state level. And I think there's a number of states that fall into that category. You got to get the diverse group of stakeholders to the table, and you have to have efficient tools to be able to monitor licensees for compliance. Because what we found is and we have a support line at Metrc that fields a number of different support calls from industry on a daily basis. And one thing that we're learning from the industry that's really encouraging is that they really have a strong will to comply with the regulations. And I would argue that nobody has rolled out a really strong, well-established regulatory framework in the first 12 months. This takes time. This is very difficult work, and having sat in the seat of the regulator, of course, there's a special place in my heart for them because of the challenges that they take and all of look, Colorado probably took 15 years off my life, but I'm really proud of the work that we've done there. And I'm really proud of some of the work that we've seen some of the other state agencies, that even though they can adopt some of the regulations and some of the best practices that other states have brought on, there's new public policy issues that are creating challenges, whether that's home delivery, on-site consumption. Let's not forget how big of an issue, rightfully so, that it's been here of late to make sure that that there's inclusion and equity built into the markets from the get-go. And so all of those things have the potential of adding to the time that it takes to fully implement. But it doesn't. But the first 12 months is probably not the best indicator of whether or not a regulatory framework is going to get off the ground effectively.
What are some of the dumbest, silliest, stupidest regulations that have crossed your desk? And here you don't even need to name states. You can just be like, I think the whole, a lot of the not in my backyard stuff gets to be a little silly. I live in California, so, I think the whole Beverly Hills thing is, a little bit ridiculous. But
my town, Short Hills,
yes.
Just NIMBY GTI. It drives me nuts.
Well, I'll avoid the state, but I think one of the funniest for me, and I don't know if funniest is the best term, but one of the most memorable was when a group during edibles regulation wanted edible products to be have a smell like rotten eggs incorporated into the edibles, so that you use the edible kind of like natural gas. It smells like rotten eggs, and regulators look to be able to regulate really consistently. So even if you were to add a color to an edible or a smell, those are really hard things to make repeatable, because you might say green, but is it a bright green or a dark green? Or you might say it needs to smell like alcohol, or it needs to smell like rotten eggs. Those things are really difficult to be able to consistently regulate. And so we, kind of looking back on that, there's no way to be able to track that type of thing for compliance, even in the most robust of seed to sale systems. So that one definitely stood out for me.
How about like the individual wrapping of edibles? Like if you have chocolate covered espresso beans, and each one is 10 milligrams or one dose. Some states make you wrap each bean individually, and creates a tremendous amount of waste because it's all done with single-use plastic.
Yeah, we addressed a lot of that in regulations in an area I'm really familiar with there in Colorado, where we allowed businesses to package. Well, first of all, we said edibles, adult use edibles had to be 10 milligrams. And you had to have each serving separated. So we gave the industry, and the industry worked really closely with us to give them the tools that they need to be able to find the right balance between protecting public health and safety. And I don't know if you guys recall or not, but when Colorado first launched, there was a couple of really tragic incidents, both of which were really heavily tied to overconsumption of edibles and having an adverse reaction for the person who took the edible. So we were really concerned that those edible products were an altogether different product than, say, a joint was. And so we really wanted to find that right balance. And again, I've talked about this a lot. Getting the right people to the table is really important. And then also, too, is being able to trace those products back to the origins of the product is really critical for being able to identify product that might be harming others. And so labeling certainly plays a role in that. But so does the seed to sale tracking that starts early in the plant life cycle and goes all the way through to the point of sale, and includes all those manufacturing touch points.
Metrc is at its core a software as a service company, and it's really hard to do enterprise level software as a service for global customers. But you have now, dozen plus customers that are state governments. Shit breaks all the time. Version you're not on version 1, you're on version 20.2.x beta, whatever. How do you guys communicate to your stakeholders when you have to fix something because a state has changed a regulation and it has to percolate out through your software? How do you explain this other than saying shit breaks?
Well, so generally speaking, in all 14 jurisdictions we operate, the policy is still very dynamic. And our system is tightly tied to the public policy that's evolving over time. And as a result, there's oftentimes needs that arise both from legislative processes and from rulemaking processes that necessitate the need for us to do some additional development into the system. That process for us starts very early with the regulator or the customer or our government customers really starting to understand what those business requirements are going to need to be for those particular policy changes. So home deliveries, a good example of that. On-site consumption's another really good example of additional development we've done since the early days. So legislation and rulemaking changes, we have to make those changes within the system. So what we do is we make sure that as that new development is making its way through the processes, that we're prepared both with our support team, but also our systematic communication tools, which are available right in Metrc, and industry bulletins, that we're putting out detailed descriptions of what the new development is and what it's going to look like, and how you use it and who you call if you need help. And I would say, one of the things, there are handfuls of things that I am very, very proud of with Metrc. One of them is our support and training team. Our support and training team is designed to help promote proficient use of the system. It's not designed to hurry up and get people off of the phone. And so our support team is empowered to identify problems or challenges or needs of the regulated community, and driving solutions to those problems. So when we have a production release that involves some new development in the system, our support team is always at the ready to be able to help with new training. They're there to answer questions. And on a side note, we've also noticed that our support team becomes somewhat of a reporting mechanism for jurisdictions as they become more and more mature. So all that is to say is communication starts early. There's an iterative process to make sure that we have the right development going into the system, and then there's a robust communication plan that precedes the release into production.
As Lewis and I were talking about you coming on the podcast earlier, we were saying how you guys have really risen to become a brand in and of itself, like the Kleenex of cannabis tech, if you will. You're welcome. You can have that tagline. I'm okay with it. Yeah. Can you talk about brand building in this industry, because it is so difficult and it is so state by state and it is so different? How did you rise to the level of Kleenex?
Well, I think first is you probably don't aspire to that. I really think that a lot of Metrc's success was in the laser beam focus it had to make the case for proper regulation and really supporting the will of the regulator to monitor and enforce in legalization, and that in doing so, that it would create a credible regulatory framework that people had some confidence in. And so I think the fact that they've been so focused on that aspect of the business, I think that made some of the other decisions that come down the line much easier to make. So, for example, do we have some money that we've made this last 6 months? Do we want to use that to challenge an RFP like our competitors do, or do we want to reinvest that back into the company? And I think the decision's always been, let's keep reinvesting that back into the company. Let's keep evolving the product. Let's then incorporate from just the regulators. Like I mentioned before, the will to comply coming out of the industry is something I didn't anticipate at the time I was a regulator. And I've really learned over the last 10 years of being in this policy space that the industry really does have a strong will in aggregate to comply. That doesn't mean there's not bad actors, but I would say all in all, they recognize the value of the credible regulated framework. And I think we were just in the right place at the right time, where we focused really hard on helping make government successful, recognize that for that to happen, you also have to have willing participants in the regulatory framework. And we ended up kind of being a bridge in a centralized reporting system that otherwise usually you usually have a more of an adversarial relationship between the regulated community and the regulator. And I think in a lot of ways we're able to avoid that, at least have been able to avoid that. And so I think just that real laser on here's our product, here's what we're all about. We haven't branched off and done a lot of other new product lines. We haven't branched off and tried to create all new revenue streams. We tried to get really good at what we're focused on and perfect it over time. And then as soon as we perfect it, we realize it's not perfect, and we just keep trying to build on it from there.
You mentioned competing against your competitors and reinvesting cash. You know, one of your competitors went public this year. We used to represent MJ Freeway, Akerna. You guys are not a public company. What are your capital markets aspirations, if you can talk about them? Or are you intending to stay private for the foreseeable future?
No, I don't necessarily know what the future holds in terms of how this company is structured, say 3 to 5 years down the road. What we do know is that in a lot of ways we're positioned really well to be able to expand into new states as more and more permissive cannabis policy is approved. I think there could be as many as 19 new states this year doing some form of either medical program and or adult use program. So it might be one of the busiest legislative sessions of all time if that were to hold true. So we see just such a tremendous opportunity there. And so we feel really strongly that we have a very good system and that it'll continue to be attractive to new state agencies and even other countries. So our primary focus is being able to provide the system to a broader group of industry stakeholders as that continues to go. I think, we kind of casually, kind of jokingly mentioned a little bit earlier about lettuce. It has been really fascinating to watch the cannabis use case and how comprehensively regulated everyone anticipates it to be, but how efficiently that can actually be done. I think is shown that cannabis policies actually leapfrog other more antiquated policy that is still trying to strictly regulate an industry that it doesn't have the centralized data point to do so. And so maybe over time we'll start to see the cannabis use case get the attention of other regulated industries like cold chain and the lettuce industry and other types of agricultural products as a means to be able to more effectively regulate. And again, it's not about creating a burden on the industry, because I think a lot of people view systems like Akerna and BioTrack and Metrc as being a burden to the industry. Well, in our case, we really feel like we're not. We're a support mechanism that kind of helps bridge the transparency between the regulated community and the regulator. And I think that you could really see that take off in the coming years. So if that's true, and that gets some momentum, all bets are off on what that means in our positioning within the capital market space.
Louis, I think both my Louis and I would agree that you've been one of the more humble guests we've ever had on our show, and yet your contribution, really to the industry has been immeasurable. You talked about some early, failures in your career and in regulating this crazy freaking space. We ask all of our guests, talk about a failure where you learned something and it helped shape your career, and made you better.
I would say there's probably two areas that I would have really liked to have done better. And I've kind of alluded to both of them, and this would probably take us back to the 2014 kind of the time frame. And the first one was edibles regulation. I think I could have, and maybe even we collectively as a state could have been a little bit more responsive to and a little bit more intuitive about the differences between edible products and products that people were smoking and how those impact consumers of those products. So I think that's number one. What I learned though from that is that if you can put together the right group of people into the room, even if those interests are competing, and you guys have to, I'm pontificating a little bit because this is the subject of my dissertation in my PhD program, but if you can put together a real diverse group of people, and you put the regulator in the position of facilitating a good public policy outcome where everybody's interested in the public interest, not just the public interest groups, but if everybody's interested in defining what's in the best interest of the public, you can actually come up with some really good public policy. And so I think the failure is that we didn't recognize the problem as soon as we should. The take-home message is that you can correct those kinds of failures if you can get the right people to the table to problem solve it. So I think that was one. And if you'll indulge me a second, I think in Colorado, the other thing that we just didn't get in time, and I think it's really still maybe even creating some real challenges for the state now, is we were so fixated on public health and safety and getting that original round of public policy out that we didn't really pay a lot of attention to the equity inclusion focus that we're starting to see or have been seeing in a lot of the other states. And as you guys know, that's a central issue up in the Northeast. I think that's going to be an issue that they're going to have to be able to address. New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, for there to be successful legalization. And so I think now the take home and the lesson learned from that is if you should have public policy that addresses those concerns, and that you should try and do it as early in the process of a state adopting the public policy, so that you can get it incorporated on the front end. It's exponentially harder for states and local jurisdictions to try and incorporate that policy once the industry is already up and running and very robust.
All right, last question. If you were to wake up tomorrow and open up the Tampa Tribune or the Florida Sun Sentinel, what's the one story you wish the media were covering about the cannabis industry that they're just sleeping on, that nobody's paying attention to?
I don't know that. So I mean, the one that comes to mind is the vaping crisis, and in particular, I don't think people realize the value of the data that's in a system like Metrc. A system that is centralized where licensees or the regulated community or the businesses that are participating report into a system their inventory, when it's tested, when it's transported. I mean, they've all adopted this process or these processes and kind of operationalized them into their businesses. And the value of that data is to both the government and to those individual businesses is what can really help to formulate a credible regulated framework. And so I would love to see some attention paid to that, maybe in the backdrop of the vaping crisis. We don't miss that opportunity that you were talking about earlier. And we look at other ways to be able to utilize that data to better protect public health first and foremost, but also to inform public policy going forward that has the potential to help with economic development, has the potential to be able to refine the public policy so it's not so onerous on the industry. And it also has the ability to make the regulator much more efficient and much more effective at actually accomplishing the public policy goals that are usually handed down from constitutional amendments and state legislatures.
Louis, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I'm sorry we have to cut it short. I would love to continue, but I can't. Truly, we'd love to have you back.
We would love to come back, and in the meantime, feel free to consider us an ongoing resource for you all.
Awesome.
We would love that. Thank you so much,
Yes.
Louis. Great meeting you.
All right. Great meeting you too. Look forward to meeting you all in person sometime.
Definitely.
Our thanks to Louis Koski, Chief Operating Officer at Metrc. Check them out at Metrc, metrc.com. As always, thank you for listening. I know I've been saying this a lot recently, but honestly, the time that you give us is time that you will never get back, and that you choose to spend it with me and Ann, our guests, Shay and Nick, is something that we don't take for granted. So truly, thank you for giving us your time, your attention. And if you want to chat with us, you can reach us on Twitter with the handle @the_greenrush, or on Instagram @the_greenrush_podcast. You can drop me or Ann an email, or Shay or Nick or the guests or whomever. The email is greenrush@kcsa.com. We're always looking for your feedback, for any guest ideas, questions that you want us to ask, any of that stuff. And please remember to rate and review and sign up and subscribe to the podcast on Apple or on Stitcher or on Spotify, wherever you're listening to us. The more you do that, the more people can find out about this show. So that what we won't be is the best kept secret in cannabis. We'll just be the best podcast in cannabis. And with that, that's one take, Shay. One take.